Olcott, New York. Once known for its Coney Island-like beach attractions that drew tourists from all over the world. Over the years, many of these attractions have closed, but thanks to recent efforts, Olcott's economic prosperity is beginning to return to the region. Much of its current success is due to its parks, waterfront shops, sports fishing, and its many festivals. While many cities around the United States have been tearing down their Civil War monuments, Olcott is preserving its history by recently restoring a Civil War memorial that pays honor to all those in their community who fought and died for their country. Once again, this soldier is standing tall, welcoming all those who visit.
You know, at this time when the statue was erected in 1899, there were a lot of Civil War veterans that were still remained, and many were passing away. And so they wanted to find a way to memorialize, Civil War veterans, and so a lot of these were put up in communities across the Northeast at the time. There was a couple of companies, one we think in Massachusetts and another in Connecticut, we're not sure which one it's from, that were building these monuments, and they would offer the communities or groups that were putting them up, different styles and sizes, depending on how much they wanted to spend and how big of a memorial they wanted, and how significant they wanted it to be, and even the soldier is it's not the depiction of somebody from Olcott, but it's a design of a Civil War soldier that the manufacturing companies made, and so you might actually see the same soldier standing on a monument in some other community as you travel around. If you go around to places like Delaware Park in Buffalo, there's a Civil War memorial that looks very similar. If down the other side of Rochester, down around Canandaigua, there's a community called Shortsville that has a Civil War memorial that's much like this. Leroy near Batavia also has a Civil War memorial there. And they're very common out around Ohio and Pennsylvania and in New England. And so you may see them in communities as you travel around in all these areas that had soldiers that were fighting in the Civil War. The memorial itself is in 4 pieces. The soldier itself is one piece, and there's also 3 stacking style of base pieces. Part of this design was to make it so it's movable in terms of being being able to be handled because of its weight and size, and also the bases as different sizes help with the stacking process in terms of making it more stable when it stands, because the soldier is so heavy. Each side of the memorial depicts different people and leaders and events that took place in the Civil War time. For example, there are pictures of generals and also a picture of Abraham Lincoln that are etched onto the memorial because they were such well-known and influential leaders in the Civil War period and Civil War history. And then also the panels have 74 names of local Civil War veterans, mostly from northern Niagara County. Not all, they branch out beyond Olcott into northern Niagara County, folks that were in the Civil War, because they all were members of the same Civil War group of soldiers that fought at the time. And some people from out of town, are actually looking to see if some of them are some of their long-lost relations or relatives. They heard that they may have been from this area and they fought in the Civil War, and they'll come and they'll look for their names on the particular statue. Also, on the 4 sides represent the battles or the areas where this regiment fought during the Civil War. Whether it was Gettysburg or some of the other Civil War sites and battles that occurred down through Pennsylvania and Virginia and Maryland and West Virginia. Some of those sites where they actually did their fighting and lost some of their members are actually noted on 4 sides of the statue. I think it's significant in that, how much impact the Civil War had on our communities and on families, in that time. I mean, almost every family that fought and lived in the Civil War period, in the Civil War time, had sons and daughters that went off to that war. Some had multiple members of the family that went off to war, whether they were brothers or uncles or whatever the case may be. So that, after the Civil War, that impact on the community in terms of those that came back, either with memories of the war and that were injured, and certainly those that were killed in action in the war. That had a big impact on those families for decades. We have pictures of families and people. A lot of people over the years have had their pictures taken in front of it because it kind of symbolizes Olcott and the center of Olcott, and when you reach back into your family photo album and you see a picture of one of your past family members having their picture taken in front of the statue, you know that they have a strong connection to the Olcott community. It was in the late 1800s and early 1900s, after it had been erected in the middle of the intersection. That was a good home for it because it was right in the center of the community, right in the center of the town. And as people took their horse and buggies and bicycles and things, they traveled around it and admired it. And there was always a lot of, in the summertime there would be Memorial Day or the 4th of July, there would be ceremonies and so forth. Olcott had the big pioneer picnics that occurred in the Pine Grove, which is now Kroll Park. And so there was a lot of activity centered around the Civil War Memorial as well. And it was a gathering place. It was in the center of the community. So it got a lot of attention and became a meeting place for a lot of folks. But as we moved out of the horse and buggy years and into the later, towards 1920 or so, cars became more popular, automobiles, and they started to smash into it. When it was taken apart, it was noticed that there was a lot of repairs that had been made to the statue over the years, where it may have been disrupted or damaged because of some of these accidents. And that was when they decided to move the statue out of the intersection for a short time, 2 years, to the Olcott Methodist Church, and then over to the street, Lockport Street, 100 yards or so that goes from the main street down to the lake. And they moved it when they moved it over there to get it out of the intersection, so it wasn't being run into as much. And they also had some railings and barriers. They tried different concrete barriers and metal railings and rope railings and so forth. And it did better over on Lockport Street when they got it out of the middle of the intersection. That helped with damage from fewer cars. But it's still, time wears on these things. The statue, of course, has been there for over 115 years. The group of Civil War veterans that helped organize and get the statue built and erected was called the Samuel Kemp Group of Civil War Veterans, and they were a regiment that was organized in the Civil War with people and soldiers from this area, and they named the regiment in honor of Samuel Kemp. As far as we know, the government didn't pay anything for erecting and purchasing the statue. It was they had to raise $1,000, which was a challenge at that time. They raised money from the community and citizens in the community and veterans organizations and families of the Civil War veterans. They got one particular large donation of about $200 by somebody from Colorado. To do something like this today in 2018, I'm just guessing, but I think you'd be looking at upwards of $100,000. Many of us in the community had been concerned about the condition of the statue, and we knew for many years that it needed some upgrading, needed some restoration. So we started looking into options and things that we could do to actually get the restoration done. We looked at organizations and specialists that do this kind of thing as far away as Ohio. But fortunately, we found a specialist here in Lockport that can do the work, and And so over the period of a couple of months, we got to work on it, and we're very pleased with the results.
When we first went and took a look at it to try to assess what was wrong with it, there was a lot of cracks throughout the structure. There were several bullet holes actually in the back of the soldier's waist. Someone had shot him years ago. I talked to a number of welders that were skilled in specialty items, and I found a gentleman that was willing to help a bit. His name is Mr. Stebline, and through that we figured out the appropriate action to take in the restoration of this, and we tested the metal and the means of fixing it and giving it some solid body. And at that time then I took the project after doing quite a bit of research on it. A lot of the damage had been done just simply from aging. These were cast when people they knew how to do the skill but didn't understand the repercussions possibly of some of the stuff they were doing. Although most of the damage was done from this monument being struck by vehicles a number of times over the years. And that was what caused a bulk of the damage to it. The damage we found at that time examining it ended up being very minor compared to what I found once we started cleaning it up. It had been patched multiple times with body filler, with just cheap lead that had been melted to fill in some of the holes and cracks, which was non-structural, non-bonding, but it served a function at that time. Areas that were dark gray patches on it we thought were just dirt. As it turns out, they were spray paint over top of body filler. So when I started the restoration, there was a few surprises. This is the very base, the portion that sits on the concrete where it all starts. This is what carries the ultimate load on top of the concrete. This was bowed severely on all four sides, and it was cracked in a number of places. There was actually pieces, such as here, right in here, there was probably about a 6-inch piece of this was actually missing. And on the back side, there was a large chunk that was missing from it also. So we had to recreate those pieces, and it all had to be brazed back together. And we found using specific materials for sandblasting would create the natural color, so the brazing would match, and it actually created a pretty flawless color match. This piece here, once it was heated up and straightened out and all the brazing was done, where we filled it all back in and recarved the lettering, then I put extra supports in here. We took hardwood and wrapped it in fiberglass, and then took fiberglass gel and attached them at what could potentially become a weak spot for further damage. And that was it. This actually has a production number inside of this. Each of these have an actual production number, and they're sequenced, all four pieces, so the numbers match just like cars in an engine. These were cast with sand molds. These are made from a mixture of lead and soft metals that were melted together, because lead on its own can't support this kind of weight, so they put white metals or light, soft metals in, which, from what I'm told, was whatever the casting guy could find. Wagon wheels, straps to barrels, old shovel heads, rakes, anything that was, a malleable type metal. And when the pieces are broke open, when we found pieces that were cracked, you can see the metal, shards of metal suspended in the lead. It's like a crystalline form, but that's what gives us some strength. This is piece number 2 from the ground up. This is the piece that has all the information on it about the monument, the soldiers that fought, and also ones that passed at these battles, and where they're from. This is the cover plate that you gain access to it, okay? And that piece is just 4 little bolts that hold it in place. This piece was bent very badly, and the whole corner was off of it. This up in here was completely shattered and taken out, so we had to rebuild this entire inside of the arc. A lot of these were damaged pretty bad. I had to fill them in and then carve them back out so they looked like what they were supposed to look like. This was crushed, so I had to rebuild, just fill it in and then carve it out. Similar damage to the other sides of it. This one, I had to put a brace on the back side of this, a fiberglass brace similar to what we did in the base. And then cleaned it up and resoldered the top of it, as it was pretty shot here at the top. And that was it for this one, although it added up to a lot of hours. This is piece number 3 from the ground up. This is what the soldier actually sits on. All these this one does not have a lip like the others do. This just has little guides for bronze pins, which we have to install in the base to sit in, just to keep it so it can't move around, slide around. This was the worst piece of all. That probably more than half of this upper portion had to be rebuilt, and more than half, probably 60% of this baseline had to be rebuilt. Probably 60% of these flowers were non-existent. They had to be recreated by just building blobs of the silver-filled lead and then milling them down and do the final hand carving with a Dremel tool. The busts all had problems all the way around it. They needed some kind of restoration, one or another. The base of this had to have completely be resupported because everything that was cast into it was gone from the car accidents. One of the wreaths were missing. 2 of them were damaged, which we just had to rebuild them. One of them was completely broken off and shattered. So I took the good one, removed it, created a silicone rubber mold, and you can see the detail that's created in these. And then I cast a resin one, a new resin piece, and reattached it, and no one can tell the difference. I filled the resin with metal filings that were appropriate to color, and there it is. Reattached it, and this piece is then ready for reassembly. All right, and this is the final piece, the soldier. This is the piece that everybody notices. He was damaged, things that were simple enough to fix. The only thing I couldn't braze back together was one of the bullet holes in his back, as the metal was stretched so thin that as I was trying to heat it up, the hole kept growing. So we had to use body filler to fill that particular spot. That's the only place I couldn't use the actual metals to fix them with. We're going to put new cleats in the base to hold them down. The rifle was heated up and straightened out as it was bent, and I had to cast a new hammer for the rifle. So the village bought a real hammer for it, and I made a rubber mold, as I did for the wreaths, and we cast a resin hammer. I attached it to the gun then, at that point. So the other piece that was damaged and part of it missing was the bayonet. This bayonet had been broken off about right here, and this piece was bent in, so it was cracked and loose. So I took a grinder, I cut it off. I took the remainder of that, and with pictures and appropriate measurements, I epoxied a piece of wood to it and then carved to match the pictures the rest of the bayonet. At that time, I cast another mold and poured it, and then we pulled it out, and this is the result. This is the new one, and it's just epoxied and glassed onto as though it was cast to begin with. This soldier is not one piece. He was made in multiple pieces. His head is actually two pieces. There's a seam that runs around it. So the back of his head and the top of his hat is one piece. The face and the bib on the front of his hat is a second piece. His hands and the rifle were cast as another piece, and they were put together. His pants down, his legs were each an individual piece, as was his primary body was just an individual piece of a casting. So this was not done all as one casting. His hands are solid, so I would imagine the hands and the gun are quite heavy. On the back side of him is where the bullet holes were. One was up in here and the other one was down in here. And this one, the metal had been stretched so thin that I had to repair with fiberglass because it was just stretched too thin. And then there was down in here, there was a big dent from a third bullet hitting it.
Hopefully it'll stand there for, another 100 or more years, and it may need some more restoration by then, but they'll realize how important it was to us today, too.